We're going to also talk about parcels here as well, mostly from a real estate perspective and mostly drawing upon the example of Amazon in the United States. So I know there's people from Amazon in the audience, so we might get a mouthful regarding this. Okay, next slide, please. Quick, again, when we talk about all this, when we talk about all the retail sector, I find it fascinating because if you want to simplistically define what is e-commerce, you could say it's a shift of the inventory from the store to the warehouse. So if you the most simple definition you can have is basically shift of inventory. What used to be somewhere is somewhere else, and that somewhere else creates a fair amount of complications or opportunities depending upon how you see the thing. So next slide, please. So what I've noticed when we talk about e-commerce is 4 fundamental impacts on freight distribution, which are already partially discussed. One is obviously change in the pattern of distribution. B2C, we know that pretty well. The last mile logistics is going to be discussed. But what is also particularly interesting is the second effect, which is the change in the real estate footprint. Letitia's already underlined that, is it, I would say, disrupt the existing macroeconomic structure. You can call it the economic geography of cities. Particularly in North America, this has been very substantial. And that's also very, I would say, interesting why in some places the real estate sector is very disrupted in terms of, you could say, valuation, empty stores and things like that, while in other places around the world, it is less so. And there's a relatively simple answer behind this. I'm going to talk about it a bit later on. Third effect is new logistical facilities. I'm going to talk about the hierarchy of Amazon, which is quite fascinating. Last and not least, when you talk about large, I would say, e-commerce firm, I call them control freaks. That is, they are involved in the process of vertical and horizontal integration. And I'm going to provide you examples of that. Next slide, please. So why e-commerce has become so popular? Lots of factors, but one of which is real estate. That means by that it's a cost structure, and real estate is a way to achieve this differential in cost structure in terms of labor cost, in terms of, you could say, rent. And that's that chart demonstrates that, I would say, relatively clearly, and that gives a fair amount of real estate, I would say, or sorry, e-commerce firms a lot of interesting leverage in recent decades. Again, I'm going to talk about that very briefly. So next slide, please. And in the United States, we saw, I would say, a very substantial growth in the parcel deliveries everywhere else in the world. But a fun part here is, here's the data about each major carrier from United States Postal Services, FedEx, UPS, and now Amazon, which itself is jumping into that business of, you could call it a 3PL, if you wish, a third-party logistic provider, by being able to control a fair amount, I would say, of the distribution capabilities, and to some kind of a very interesting hierarchy, which, again, I'm going to talk about a bit later on. Next slide. So the reason why I would say you have a differential impact is, you could say, you could use a variable such as the real estate retail space per capita, and the United States has the highest in the world. And therefore, if there's a growth of e-commerce, this is basically the locations or the context in which these, you could say, diffusion could be the most disruptive for the retail sector, the brick and mortar. While in other places, the world, you talk about France, South Korea, Germany, of course, e-commerce is very powerful, I would say evident, but in many ways, much less disruptive. Because at start, the footprint per capita can be much lower than other parts of the world. Again, I don't have too much time. I'll skip this. Next slide, please. Skip the other one again. Skip this one. Not have enough time. So here's the fun part with Amazon. Amazon has built, you could call it a distributional places hierarchy. That is a vertically and horizontally integrated structure of different facilities, each playing a very specific role and function in the process, from the inbound logistics, of course, the classic e-fulfillment center, the sortation center, which is the hub we're going to be talking about, I would say, most over the next couple of days or so. And also, of course, all the way down to delivery station, which are forms of last mile logistics. But what is excessively interesting here is the fact that, since, unlike, let's say, a regular 3PL, Amazon is also in control of the freight. While if you're a regular 3PL, you are basically a derived demand. But Amazon is not derived demand. Amazon controls in part where the demand, so Amazon can decide how it routes the parcel within its system. And the logic is very simple. It always routes, of course, to optimize the efficiency and also to ensure that all its facilities are optimally used as much as possible. And it controls the flow by doing something like that, which is some kind of a luxury that many 3PL don't have, that would say, the opportunity to do. So next slide. So in terms of real estate, again, there are many databases available, but essentially what is that footprint? The great majority, of course, are e-fulfillment centers. But when you start to move into last mile logistics, it starts to be about 40–50% of the footprint of Amazon is now moving into these hubs within the cities themselves. And I made a calculation. Amazon have about, if you take all the square footage, Amazon has an equivalent of rent of about $3.2 billion per year of rent equivalent. That's excessively expensive, obviously, to maintain that. And that's actually a very, very conservative figure. Next slide, please. So all of this, of course, took place over time, massive diffusion, different phases, because if, say, Amazon was still following its initial business model, it would be already out of business because it was selling books, software, music. It does not do that anymore. So it wanted to migrate into the retail sector. And when it started to migrate, it forced the company to adopt a series of strategy of vertical horizontal integration. And when the pandemic hit, it went absolutely overdrive. And you can see here, in about 2 years, in 2020-21, Amazon bought more real estate than, let's say, 5 or 6 years of development were comprehended in about 2 years or so. But now the things have subdued quite substantially. Now Amazon is actually, I would say, in retrenchment. There's some issue. They have to readjust their footprint because they may have overinvested. Next slide, please. This follow, of course, exactly, I would say, the share of e-commerce in terms of retail sales in the United States. You can clearly see here the impact of the pandemic, a big surge, and now a leveling off. So it was a kind of a paradigm shift, new level of consumption, and now it remains as it is. And we'll see if the growth will continue. It's going to be basically a plateau. If it becomes more of a plateau, it's going to have a very long-term impact on the strategies or the real estate and investment strategies of e-commerce. Okay, next slide. Next, again, I don't have time for that, please. Okay, another one, please. Okay, again, simply a map of all the facilities in the United States. So those are the e-fulfillment facilities. It's about more than 300 of them. That's massive. But it was very interesting. If you do an exercise, you plot the median center. It essentially, the median center, pretty much every single type of Amazon facility in the United States is a demographic center of the United States. That was absolutely shocking. And also not shocking at the same time, because simply Amazon has a maximum spatial coverage type of strategy. And by positioning its facilities and its asset across the major cities in the United States, it essentially reflects almost perfectly the distribution of the population. Surprise, surprise. Okay, I don't have too much time, so next slide. That's the other type of facility on the network. Those are sortation centers, essentially routing facilities, mostly at the edge of cities. Next slide. All the way down, this is where Amazon has invested massively in the last 4 or 5 years, is all these what we call delivery stations, all of these last mile logistics. And roughly now, these facilities represent something like a quarter of all the footprint of Amazon in the United States. And that footprint was essentially, I would say, close to zero 4 or 5 years ago. So again, that's a continuation of the process of vertical integration taking place. So next slide, please. I don't have time for that one. I will skip. The next one is, okay, next slide. The next one is absolutely fascinating. That took a lot of time and effort, but we're both capable to calculate through samples the distribution time when a parcel is delivered at the building. And of course, it has some kind of a nice normal distribution. The peak time is between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., which is classic. So that's relatively well known. What was less known is roughly at what time the person picks up their parcel. And within the same building. That was a separate of a large building in Manhattan. And we notice about an 8-hour difference between the time of delivery and the time of pickup, approximately. So what does it mean? This is profound in ramification. It means that for 8 hours, you have to have space for that parcel to sit up in the lobby somewhere. You have to have real estate for 8 hours, and the more the number of delivery increase, the larger demand for that, you could say, in-building real estate. And in the building we looked at, it was so substantial, they were forced to close down one apartment and convert this apartment into a warehouse because the demand for parcel was clogging the lobby. So I'm not too sure how this sample could apply to other places, but I'm convinced this is usually how it works across the world. There might be difference, but overall, a parcel will sit something like 8 hours, either in a locker or in a lobby somewhere, and that consume space. And this is going to have an impact on the design of, you could say, last mile facilities, which are essentially, I would say, the places of residence. With this said, I think that's about it for today. Next slide. Again, as a conclusion, again, we have the logistical facilities, which are very, I would say, becoming increasingly specialized. There is, we didn't talk about that here, but there is a hierarchy. There is a structure. There is some kind of organization which replicate the supply chain itself. And each element of this hierarchy involve different locational strategies. Of course, when you start to enter, you would say the distribution aspect, the sortation center, you start to enter the city. And when you start to reach the last mile facilities, of course, you are within the cities. And when we look at the example of Amazon in the United States, that's exactly what they did. They build this hierarchy and they build the facilities and they move on into the cities. And by doing that, of course, they create something quite, I would say, interesting, to say the least. So with this said, as far as I'm concerned, that's about it. You can open everything for discussion. Thank you.